Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Housing Basics today. I am Stephanie Schwartz-Bailey, the Education Program Manager and Preservation Consultant at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I've worked at the Conservation Center for 10 years now, 3 as a conservation technician in the Housing and Framing Department, and additionally in preservation services, developing and presenting a variety of collections care programs for museums, libraries, and private clients. And I am very pleased to be spending the next hour with you. Preservation housing can be a challenging aspect of collection stewardship, given budgets for materials purchases, limited storage space and staff time, and conservation concerns for artifacts themselves. Yet, an appropriate box, folder, sleeve, or custom container can significantly impact an artifact's long-term stability and continued safe access. That said, the intention of this webinar today is to introduce some preservation technology that you can use to understand quality materials to come in contact with your artifacts. I will present a survey of some options for housing constructions, and the most fun part, I think, we will take a peek inside some boxes to see how they are actually functioning. And at the end of the hour, you will be familiar with the housing basics. This webinar is brought to you by the Regional Heritage Stewardship Program, which we refer to at the Conservation Center as RHSP. Funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, RHSP is an initiative of the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts that brings vital preservation services to regions of the country with limited access to conservators and preservation expertise. Conducted in partnership with the Utah Field Services providers, the Utah Division of Arts and Museums, Office of Museum Services, and Utah Humanities, the 2019-20 RHSP Intermountain West project brings workshops, webinars, and preservation needs assessments to collecting institutions in parts of Utah, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. It may not come as a surprise to you to know that for the remainder of 2020, RHSP programming will be presented in online format. And if you're interested in knowing what is coming down the road in terms of future programs, you can find upcoming events listed at ccaha.org/events. So in this webinar, first, I will introduce the significance of artifact housing, and then review preservation terminology and how to expertly describe a material or product that you're considering for use with archival, library, and museum collections. Manufacturing standards are an important resource for reference, and I will include housing scenarios for book and paper, photographs, and oversized materials, as well as some sneak peeks and technical bulletins where appropriate. And Leah Descher is going to help me by posting some of those technical bulletins to the chat box when it's time for those things to reference the webinar. So you can watch for that. Leah is our Preservation Services Assistant at the Conservation Center. She's also going to be sending a follow-up email to this webinar. So if you don't catch a technical bulletin in the chat box in the next hour, be reassured that you will receive it into your email box in the next few days. I would encourage you to submit questions too in the chat box towards the end of the webinar, but better yet, at the end of the webinar, I will share my email address. And please feel free to contact me directly to discuss your particular housing question in detail after the webinar. Why is artifact housing and the design and quality of it so significant? Well, of course, a box, folder, or envelope is a basic container that signifies a commitment to intellectual control or celebration of an artifact. More importantly, though, a housing is the first line of protection between an artifact and its ambient environment. Here, I present a detail of an infographic that CCAHA produced with the University of Pennsylvania Libraries in 2015 to illustrate the layers of conditions that an artifact is subject to in its surroundings, from the item level to the regional scale. The object enclosure surrounds the artifact. Then the object enclosure is nestled like a matryoshka doll within the building envelope, then subject to the local climate and regional climate, and I would even argue on a global scale to the conditions of climate change. The object enclosure touches the artifact too, so it has immediate impact at the micro level. It is often difficult, if not impossible, to alter historic architecture of a house museum, and it's challenging to achieve ideal conditions in a modern building envelope in an archive or library. And of course, we have no control over the climate in which our collections are situated, but we can use great care and purpose when selecting housings for our artifacts. Here, a further note on the role that housing plays in the context of holistic preventive conservation. Remember that a housing can provide additional seconds or minutes of protective safety to an artifact sustaining disaster conditions like water or fire, as the housing and not the artifact absorbs the damage first. And housing is a tool to reduce handling of an artifact during transport and user access, thereby reducing risk of damage or accelerated degradation. Boxes, folios, sleeves, and customized containers then are so much more than just a house, so to speak, for our collections. Yet I do like the connotation of the word housing as support and protection to shelter artifacts with best materials. Preservation terminology is used in the conservation field to accurately describe materials and standards that indicate appropriate contact with artifacts. Whether you buy or design and construct your own housings, preservation terminology is a tool to describe exactly what you need. Here is our list of preservation terminology, or dictionary, if you will, and the terms that I will define in detail. Archival, acid-free, buffered versus non-buffered, lignin-free, the photographic activity test, the 3 Ps, and zeolites. The scientific and derivative meanings of these words determine the quality of materials in all housing scenarios. And I have a handout that Leah will share in the chat box. It's called Selecting Materials for Storage and Display. And this handout includes the definitions of these preservation terminology words. I'll be going through the definitions of each of these words during the webinar, but sometimes it's nice to have a handout for you to reference a little later, and that's coming in the chat box. And of course, also in your email in a few days. Archival is a frequently used word. The Society of American Archivists defines archival as resistant to deterioration or loss of quality, allowing for a long life expectancy when kept in controlled conditions, not causing harm or reduced life expectancy. Well, that sounds like what we're seeking for collections care. Unfortunately, the word archival has been overused in has been overused in commercial advertising to the point that the word is nearly meaningless. One must look beyond the term archival and also the term that y'all may have heard that is like archival, conservation grade or preservation friendly. We must look beyond these kinds of words to understand precisely what a product offers. I equate the word archival in mass merchandising with natural. So when I go to the grocery store and I pick up a package and it's labeled natural, I'm keenly aware that no factual information has actually been relayed to me regarding the cultivation of that product. While archival perhaps implies appropriate use in archives, like natural may suggest derived to some degree from nature, I need more data. We seek answers to, for example, how is this product manufactured? What are its components and inherent vices? How has it performed under controlled testing? Is it truly safe for use with artifacts in the long term? Acid-free is next on the preservation terminology list. And the term acid-free refers to material which was pH neutral at the time of production. Please note here that at the time of production means that materials may become acidic over time. An acid-free designation indicates a pH neutrality of approximately 7. And manufacturers of acid-free products are entitled to use a circled infinity symbol because testing has fulfilled requirements of the American National Standards Institute or the International Organization for Standardization. Choosing acid-free materials to come in contact with collections, of course, protects artifacts from discoloration, advanced degradation, and loss. It seems easy enough to look for appropriate designations of acid-free when shopping for new materials. You look on the label, or you look for the infinity sign. But I am sometimes asked, what do I do if I don't know if the materials currently in use in my archive are acid-free? Well, certainly you would be suspect when, for example, mat board in contact with an artifact has caused staining to your artifact. Or you may observe something like collections stored in multiple within boxes are turning brittle or yellowing. In such cases, you can use a pH testing pen to evaluate whether or not a window mat or box is acidic. Note, however, that you never apply the pH testing pen to the artifact itself. In brief, a small and light-handed mark of the testing pen to a surface will cause a color change depending on the pH level. A purple result indicates a pH of 7.0 or above, defined as basic or alkaline. Yellow indicates a pH below 6.5 or acidic. pH testing pens are very affordable. Most are under $10, and they're readily available online. Lucky me, even though I'm working at home during Pennsylvania shelter-in-place orders, and I'm not in the laboratory, obviously, I do have my preservation housing sample kit here at home. And I was able to take my pH testing pen on a field trip around the house, during which I tested Post-it notes, mat board, business envelopes, and wrapping tissue with the results that I am illustrating here. You can see that only one sample registered with a yellow mark or acidic. And you can also see why, if you have any potential intention of keeping the material for use with your collections after testing, you make the testing mark somewhere discreet. When choosing between buffered and unbuffered materials for housings, you must consider how this selection may benefit the artifact. That is, buffered materials have an alkaline reserve added to them during manufacture, and it's usually around 2 to 3% calcium carbonate. This buffer, so to speak, converts the material to alkaline pH, which helps to protect the artifact it is in contact with from acid migration or acid pollutants in the immediate environment. However, an alkaline reserve depletes over time, thereby rendering the material acidic. And as a result, buffered materials need replacement at regular intervals to maintain usefulness as a buffered material. Non-buffered or unbuffered material then does not have an alkaline reserve and therefore has a neutral pH. Why would you want to choose an unbuffered material that does not have the additional benefit of an alkaline reserve? Alas, an unbuffered material is not a poor product. It does not lack preservation qualities because it's without an alkaline reserve. In fact, you would want to select an unbuffered material at times because some artifacts are highly sensitive to the alkaline reserve in buffered materials. Specifically, research has revealed that you want to avoid using buffered materials against sensitive artifacts of protein-based media like silk or wool, pearlized finishes, and some ethnographic items. And you absolutely need unbuffered materials for housing cyanotypes and blueprints because the alkalinity of buffered materials can exacerbate fading of cyanotypes and blueprints. Now, I have shown you the first sneaky peek of the webinar. Perhaps you have noticed how similar in look are the buffered and unbuffered boxes in my illustrations. So here's the buffered box, and here's the unbuffered box. At mere glance, the distinctions between the buffered and unbuffered boxes can be imperceptible, and checking product descriptions is always best. For clarity, this checklist developed by our colleagues at Lyrasis gives additional guidance for choosing between buffered and unbuffered paper, tissue, and board. In general, most paper-based items in archives and libraries will be just fine in buffered materials. However, if you have very old or unusual examples of printing processes in your collections, it may be best to use unbuffered materials. Next on the preservation terminology list is lignin-free. Lignin is a polymer found in all vascular plants. It makes vegetables firm, regulates the transport of liquid in a living plant, and in wood, binds cellulose fibers together. In nature then, lignin is biologically necessary and beneficial. However, lignin is problematic as a component of ground wood pulp papers. As lignin ages, it darkens and breaks down into acidic byproducts. Papers that are made from ground wood pulp begin their life cycle relatively acidic, but they worsen with age. A ready and familiar example is newspaper clippings made of ground wood pulp that has a very high lignin content, and you know it yellows over time and becomes brittle at the slightest touch. While lignin may be present in the fibrous matrix of an artifact, creating a tendency to deteriorate because of a fundamental instability of components, lignin should nonetheless not be introduced for use with any artifact. it is an external force of deterioration. Rag paper is not made from wood, therefore it does not have a lignin content. It is woven from cotton, linen, or other material remnants. A traditional rag paper maker shreds cloth in the same manner as an 18th century laborer did, tearing and separating strips to be dissolved into a slurry from which paper sheets are formed. And the result is a rag paper safe to use with artifacts. The designation on a product label of rag paper or rag board, or more specifically 100% cotton, ensures that that modern merchandise does not contain lignin. In addition to rag paper, one other lignin-free product is commercially available, and that is chemically treated wood pulp paper. Chemical pulp papers have been altered during the manufacturing process to remove lignin from the source. Generally, chemically treated wood pulp paper will say lignin-free on the label, but it will never mention the words rag or cotton. Sometimes, though, chemical pulp papers are manufactured to have merely a very, very low lignin content with a buffering, which is not the same as lignin-free, so buyer beware. All housings and enclosures for photographic materials must have passed the Photographic Activity Test, or PAT. Developed by the Image Permanence Institute at Rochester Institute of Technology, the PAT explores interactions after prolonged periods between photographic images and potential materials with which they might have immediate contact. The PAT is routinely used to test papers, adhesives, inks, glass and framing components, sleeves, labels, albums, and even scrapbooking supplies and their embellishments. In short, a small sandwich of detector papers, filter papers, and the testing material itself is assembled, and it's incubated for 4 to 6 weeks in temperature and humidity controlled chambers to simulate aging. The sample is then subjected to analysis for fading, silver mirroring, yellowing, or spotting. The PAT is actually a dynamic test. You can currently submit material for testing, and the reporting is ready between 8 and 10 weeks. There are many varieties of clear plastic enclosures available on the mass marketplace for encapsulating collections. Stable and robust enclosures that will not harm your archives are made of polyester, polyethylene, or polypropylene. The fourth P, as we call it, which is polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, is not stable enough to use with collections items. As it ages, PVC leaches plasticizers, causing most media to degrade and offset. You may have experienced an example of this kind of degradation if you have ever stored an inscribed document within a sleeve and after time found it stuck to the plastic and the type or the ink transferred to the surface. In this scenario, it is highly likely that the sleeve had PVC components. Zeolites cap the list of our preservation terminology. Zeolites are sieves that, due to their molecular construction, actually trap environmental pollutants or airborne contaminants, such as acetic acid, ozone, or sulfur dioxide. The zeolites, when embedded in housing materials, are superheroes, working to absorb harmful chemicals that can exacerbate an artifact's degradation and fading over time. Zeolites are indeed woven into the microfibers of interleaving paper and mat board, as you can see in the microscopic images of this slide. The zeolites are imperceptible to the eye, and they don't alter the paper or mat board matrix, and they work up to 10 years. You may be familiar with proprietary names like microchamber and art care. Microchamber paper with zeolites can be inserted behind an artifact in a sleeve or an envelope for support, and because it has those zeolites, to extend the safe lifespan of an enclosure. Art care board has zeolites too, and should be used for matting an artifact because it has that additional protection that serves well within the frame package. Well, preservation technology is a dictionary of descriptors to aid in choosing appropriate, robust, and effective materials to come in contact with artifacts. Standards set very specific performance parameters for housing materials, but in abstract form. Standards are requirements, specifications, guidelines, or characteristics that can be identified consistently to ensure that materials, products, processes, and services are fit for their purpose. Standards allow researchers and manufacturers to establish an expectation of sorts of quality assurance. Manufacturers of preservation housing supplies are not required to be compliant with industry standards. Testing to meet standards is completely voluntary. However, if you do see an indication that a product has met a standard and is labeled as such on the packaging, rigorous testing was indeed fulfilled, and that product is probably worthy of your purchase. These main regulating bodies for standards issue guidance and performance of and safe use of supplies in contact with cultural heritage. The second handout that Leah will share in the chat box is an example of 2 international standards for selection criteria when choosing supplies for photographs. So if you read over that standard, you will be familiar with the parameters, well, certainly with the way a standard is written, but also with the parameters that you should be considering when purchasing supplies for photographs. You will also notice that standards will utilize preservation technology in their recommendations. So you will be able to gain a very clear understanding both of parameters and guidelines for use of a material and product, as well as understand the very specific terms that will indicate how you should expect these materials to perform. So with all the jargon out of the way, I assembled several scenarios in the following slides to demonstrate how preservation terminology, along with unique goals of artifact use and display, come together. Ideally, as part of a system of housing, materials should have individual enclosures. These serve to provide support and protection, reducing abrasion, dust, fingerprints, cross-contamination between materials, and handling damage. Paper enclosures, specifically, are a very good option for housing documents or pamphlets with a thin dimension. In style, paper enclosures can range from envelopes sealed on 3 sides to 4 flap designs to even simple folios of sheets creased in half. But in composition, all paper enclosures must, of course, be acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered or unbuffered, depending upon the artifact placed within. Additionally, if artifacts include any elements whatsoever of photographic processes on the page, the paper enclosure must have passed the PAT. No paper enclosure of any construction should have adhesive on the inside or at the seam for risk of migration to the artifact. Paper enclosures have the advantage of being opaque, and in that way they protect from long-term light exposure, but they need to be entirely opened by any researcher to reveal the full text or imagery and thereby increase frequency of handling. Paper enclosures that are sealed on 3 sides, like those on the left of this slide, are very supportive and intuitive to use because of the thumb hole placement. Obviously, that's where you should be reaching for the artifact, but they do require a grab and slide motion to remove the artifact. Therefore, artifacts with friable media or tears and losses are not intended for storage in envelopes. Please note that envelopes may also be a slightly more appropriate housing choice for materials with a margin around the image or blank border around the text. And this is because when retrieving an artifact from an envelope, the edges are held by the user with slight pressure, and there is risk of breakage, or that residue from fingerprints will be left behind on the artifact. If you are concerned about the vulnerability of an artifact, and in fact observe any evidence of a potential conservation concern, there are reasons to consider conservation treatment before making any decision on housing. That is, an artifact that is destined for housing and potential long-term storage therein should be in stable condition first. And at this point, I would refer you to the third handout that Leah will share with us. This handout is called Conservation Treatment Priority Categories, and this handout is a valuable resource for rating, if you will, an artifact with consideration of its risk. It's a good handout for you to refer to when you are considering if you should go ahead and begin a housing project with an artifact, or perhaps consider conservation treatment to that artifact prior to housing it. Thanks, Leah. Transparent plastic enclosures are ideal for materials that require support and protection, but require frequent user access to the text and imagery on both the recto and the verso without having to remove the artifact. The enclosures are often sold pre-sealed on 3 sides, kind of forming an envelope. However, I prefer a product with a seal on just 2 adjacent sides, and that's called an L sleeve, like the letter, like the obvious shape that the seals are in. An L sleeve permits easy retrieval of an artifact without the grab and slide motion required of an envelope. L sleeves are commercially available in a variety of thicknesses, so you can choose a robust support appropriate to the fragility of the artifact. By the way, making a plastic folder that is sealed only on one side is very budget friendly. Simply purchase polyester by the yard, as pictured on the right of this slide. Cut it to size so that a 1/4 inch margin surrounds the artifact on all sides. crease it in half with a Teflon folder tool, and you have a plastic folder. Beware, however, that plastic enclosures of any style do often carry an electrostatic charge. This charge is beneficial for gently situating an artifact within an L sleeve or folder, but it can be problematic for artifacts with flaking, friable, or sensitive media. Additionally, plastic enclosures can, in certain environments, relentlessly attract airborne dust particles. But that's more of a bothersome task than anything else. As with paper housing, any plastic enclosure intended for photographic materials must have passed the PAT. At the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, we have an ultrasonic welder for fusing sheets of polyester together to create an encapsulation that is sealed on 4 sides. With this equipment, we create a microenvironment for an artifact. This treatment is only appropriate for artifacts of stable media and suitable thickness. Consideration also has to be given to the risk that a paper artifact might off-gas within the encapsulation over time. So there is a concern there with treating an artifact before it goes into an encapsulation. In the absence of an ultrasonic welder, making an encapsulation with double-sided tape at 4 edges seems really tempting. However, I would caution against this, as adhesives are notoriously persistent at migrating from their original points of contact and can not only expose an artifact to harmful byproducts during deterioration, but can become stuck to the artifact itself. Mats are a particularly attractive and supportive housing for artifacts. The uninterrupted and broad margins of a window mat are used for handling and can cover any visually distracting edges of an artifact intended for display. Mat boards should be acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered, if appropriate. Ideally, 100% cotton rag if possible. You can purchase Art Care Mat Board, which is manufactured with zeolites to protect against common oxidative and gaseous pollutants. There is a lot in our exhibition and storage spaces in the ambient environment that those zeolites can help protect against. Artifacts should be hinged to the back mat with Japanese paper strips. Never tape, never cement, or metal attachments. And we actually have a handout at CCAHA that is titled Preservation Hinging for Storage and Display. And this handout, I'm sorry, Leah may not be able to get into the chat window immediately, but it will be attached to the email that you receive in a few days. And this handout will go into more detail about preservation hinging with Japanese paper strips if you're interested in that particular housing method. Solander boxes are containers to house collections of matted art on paper, photographic prints, manuscripts, maps, or other flat artifacts. Solander boxes are elegant with linen texture and metal hardware for secure closure and distinctive labeling. With a clamshell construction, the Solander box, when open, gently drops its spine to lower one side and make for easy retrieval of contents in a smooth lifting motion. The hard exterior of a Solander box is a definite safeguard against physical force. If a Solander box makes an impressive aesthetic statement, as well as functions robustly on the interior, Another option, while simpler in construction, is equally dapper. A tuxedo box, because of 4-flap phase box design, provides proper snug and tucked protection and is highly customizable and easy to make in-house from a sheet of 20-point acid-free board. I was always inclined to believe that the tuxedo box is so called because of its trim fit, somewhat evocative to me of a tapered evening suit jacket pocket. I may be getting a little poetic here, but we all know that preservation housing is not merely a container after all. Anyway, boxes for books come in a variety of constructions for ease of access and are intended to support a fragile volumes text block and any compromises in the sewing supports, as well as contain any potentially loose pages. The tuxedo box lends rigid support. It protects at all 4 vulnerable corners. It is simple to use, and it suits small, lightweight volumes that have prestige, if not heft, in collections. The tuxedo box is unique to each volume, and, deservedly so. Here are attendees of a workshop presented for your colleagues in the RHSP Appalachia region recently, at which we made drop front boxes with lids for Precious Hardy Boys books. Drop front boxes are constructed of acid-free board with a fluted interior. The fluting adds strength to the material, yet allows for airflow. The corners of a drop front box are sealed and smooth. They're ideal for surrounding books with damage to the spine or end bands. Drop front boxes allow a book to rest flat and then be removed in a safe lift motion, and drop front boxes can be stacked. The housing of photographs can have similar consideration to those of paper or books, but additional precautions are always taken to protect the chemical processes on delicate print surfaces. Of course, I'm beginning to sound a bit like a broken record, but all materials in contact with photographs must indicate passage of the PAT. Ideally, as part of a system of housing, photographs should also have individual enclosures. These serve to provide support and protection, reducing abrasion, dust, fingerprints, cross-contamination between materials, and handling damage. So plastic or paper enclosures to house your photographic prints. Again, consider the frequency of user access, the risk of light exposure, and overall fragility of the photograph itself within the microclimate of an enclosure. It is appropriate to place an interleaving page behind a photograph in an envelope or sleeve to lend a little bit of rigidity. And as for space saving, you may place 5 to 10 prints of the same size in one folder, as long as interleaving papers are positioned between them to prevent abrasion. Both the folder and the interleaving papers should be slightly larger than the artifact of the photograph, at least ½ inch on all sides. Glass plate negatives and lantern slides in good condition should be stored vertically. This arrangement helps to minimize damage from impact by distributing pressure to the bottom. However, glass itself is heavy, and any stack of glass plate negatives can succumb to breakage, so limit the number of glass plates in one box, filling vacant areas with spacers of acid-free or lignin-free and PA-tested board. Glass plates should additionally be stored individually in 4-flap enclosures of PA-tested paper. The 4-flap design creates overlays of complete coverage and enables the plates to be placed in and removed from the 4-flap without any scratching from sliding. Glass plate negatives that have broken can be separated in envelopes, but when the fragments are united into a customized sync mat, the user is able to view the entire image compositionally. A customized sync mat also provides further protection against edge loss from abrasion from one shard. Granted, a custom sync mat is a complex housing solution, but it's very worthwhile for glass plate negatives of significant value to a collection or as a temporary housing while awaiting conservation treatment. Film strip negatives should be housed individually also in PAT-approved paper or polyester sleeves, or for a more cohesive grouping in a multi-pocket page. Both of these sleeve-style housings can in turn be assembled, grouped, and organized within a box or binder. Sleeves can be organized by subject, site location, or film roll number, for example. It's nice because there is significant space to record any important information on the sleeve's exterior or on the tab of the pocket page. When labeling, always remove the negative first and use a soft graphite pencil, and those are numbered 4B or 6B for the paper sleeves. And you can use a Sharpie marker, but on the plastic enclosure only. Never write on the negative directly. Rolled panorama photographs are extremely brittle, and forcing them to unfurl can cause cracking or breaks. So it is appropriate to house panoramas rolled vertically in a box until a later time when they can be humidified and flattened by a professional conservator. Photographic albums and scrapbooks pose a unique challenge, especially if tchotchkes, textiles, organic material, or handwritten notes on the pages are all part of the overall composition. One may be tempted, if the album pages are acidic or indicate any other conservation concern, to remove the photographs and store them separately. It will have to be decided, in fact, if the historical value of the album and the user's holistic experience with it require that the bound structure remain intact with its components. Does the sequential order of the photographs tell a story? Does the relationship of the photographs to surrounding embellishments contribute valuable meaning? If so, perhaps the album might be considered a comprehensive artifact in its own right. Digitization then is an option to preserve the unique structure and arrangement of the photographs in an album or scrapbook. High-definition facsimile prints can be bound to create a surrogate book for users to peruse. The historic album then can be housed in an acid-free box. Oversized materials can be imposing not only in size, but in complex requirements for housing. Ideally, oversized flat materials should be housed in an appropriately sized box or in a folder within a file drawer. Here, my colleagues at the Conservation Center demonstrate for scale that sometimes these housings are end-to-end larger than an arm span. Within a flat file drawer, there should never be a stack of artifacts so high that the drawer has difficulty closing. Aligning all the file folders within the drawer in the same direction makes for ease of access. What does not belong in flat file drawers are oversized rolled artifacts. They will tumble to the corners of the drawers and can catch on a latch or a hinge. Instead, oversized rolled artifacts should be wrapped around a large diameter, acid-free, lignin-free paper tube for support. The tube extends beyond the edges of the artifact by several inches at both ends. An interleaving paper is secured behind the artifact as it laps around the tube so that the verso of the artifact does not abrade the surface when it's rolled upon itself. Of course, if your oversized rolled artifact is a blueprint, unbuffered interleaving paper is used instead of the alkaline. A file swaddle is made of a sheet of thin acid-free and lignin-free paperboard tied in place with soft cotton twill. The wound and wrapped tube can then be nestled into bumpers and slightly elevated from a shelf or the bottom of a box. And now, how about a peek into the box to see how an artifact is safely housed within it. Storage boxes come in dozens of varieties, of course. What's most important is that they're made from acid-free, lignin-free cardstock and board and have passed the PAT if intended for photographic materials. Boxes can be buffered or unbuffered as required. When choosing between a vertical or a horizontal box, a matter of preference and use usually is the guide. That is, collections stored in files that are referenced very often can benefit from vertical housing because to access one, you don't need to remove all of the others from the box. A horizontal box, however, requires files to be stacked. And additionally, there needs to be caution to ensure that the bottom layer doesn't bear too much pressure from above. Vertical boxes benefit from the inclusion of spacers, not only to add rigid support to the files within, but to provide a vertical framework for the box that prevents it from tipping over. Spacers are made of acid-free, lignin-free board, and they should fill all the empty space of a box. If artifacts of different sizes are housed within one box, spacers of equal length distribute the pressure points between artifacts, preventing smaller artifacts from leaning into larger ones. Oh my, this box is overstuffed. The sides are distorting. Because there are no spacers on the interior, these papers have begun to curl and push their weight into a heap. Additionally, one of the pamphlets is too tall for the box and surely abraded each time the lid presses on its delicate text block. And this box is too large for the contents. Artifacts of similar size should be housed together. Sometimes it is possible to use folders or sleeves of identical size to create uniformity within the box and prevent dissimilarly sized artifacts from shifting around. And I do appreciate that here at least an attempt was made to fit sleeves snugly within the box by turning the artifacts in various directions. But this makes a very confusing situation for the user. When they open the box, the images are presented in various alignments. Boxes that do not have a drop front require stronger effort from the user to remove the contents, potentially subjecting artifacts to risk of bending and breakage. A box will last longer also if it is not stretched or otherwise made to withstand physical force for any reason, including access. This box of acid-free corrugated board has been modified to accommodate multiple smaller artifacts within using removable trays on which artifacts are secured between bumpers of additional corrugated board. And in this scenario, trays are properly supported so as not to cause pressure to artifacts below, and cotton twill handles are used to remove the trays easily and safely, rather than requiring that a user jam their fingers into a box to remove an artifact. Once preservation terminology is mastered and the variety of options for construction understood, any housing scenario is attainable. Here, acid-free corrugated board is used to build a custom-sized box to house a scroll, and in the other image, a historic weapon. The scroll, very much like the rolled design for an oversized paper artifact, hangs on rods that sit on a bumper. Again, the bumper elevates the scroll a bit so that the artifact does not rest for the long term in one position of contact with the bottom of the box. Still, the scroll will periodically be turned to prevent permanent bending at any one length of the scroll. The bumpers are made of Volara, a polyethylene foam that has a grippy texture and is available in a variety of densities. In the other box, artifacts are nestled in troughs of individual size that have been lined with soft Tyvek fabric, which is pH neutral and inert with a soft texture. Cotton twill ties lend additional security within the box. Collections can present a myriad of housing conundrums. What style? What size? Of which material? With preservation terminology, many of these questions can be qualitatively answered. And guided by an understanding of user access needs and options for customization, housing basics are foundational to best practices in collections care and an opportunity to explore beyond the mere container. Thank you for joining the webinar today. I am now going to open up the chat box and see if folks have some questions that they'd like to talk about now, or please feel free to email me at sbailey@ccaha.org. At this time, since we're working at home, I have the luxury of being able to answer emails in detail. And sometimes housing questions are so complex and unique to a particular scenario, it's nice to have a more in-depth conversation with a collections care manager about what's actually happening and what the priority concerns are. So yes, please do email me. It's a great time for us to have conversations about your housing questions. Okay. Gosh, we have a colleague joining us from Egypt today. Hi, and thanks for joining us. So, any recommendations for pre-constructed microfilm boxes that have zeolites? Not off the top of my head, Lindsay. The caution though for microfilm boxes is that you may be intending to house photographic materials in these boxes, and more important than the zeolite designation would be the PAT test designation. So it may be more appropriate that an unbuffered box is appropriate for the microfilm. We could do some more research into that depending on what exactly the kind of artifact is that you'd like to put into the boxes. Please email me if you would like me to research some specifics on that. I've heard that enclosures are sometimes created, leaving small gaps in the seal. Would you recommend? Yes, it is oftentimes very beneficial to not encapsulate with 4 seals an artifact for the very reason that you are creating a microenvironment within the 4 seals. And for this reason, the L sleeve is a particularly wonderful choice for housing artifacts. You would be surprised by how secure the seal is, even though the L sleeve is welded only on 2 sides. So it is a very robust and secure kind of housing, but there is no risk of creating the microenvironment. So in most cases, I actually suggest an L sleeve. So my goodness, there's so many comments. I'm scrolling down looking for the next question. Oh, do you have a handout on making phase boxes? I do. And making phase boxes is one of the most fun things ever. So Janet, would you please email me this week or next week so that I can reply to you directly? I know I have, if not 1, 2 handouts to share with you. And I actually have an entire workshop that I have taught on making phase boxes and 4-flap enclosures also. So I'm happy to share with you tips from those workshops. I see a question about AV materials. We do have some separate webinars on preservation and housing of AV materials. And Leah, if you're still here on the chat, that can be found on the DIPSNY website. So maybe you could stick that into the chat box. My thoughts on photocopying newspaper clippings and then disposing instead of keeping the originals are the following. I have found in my own personal research and in working with institutions that many newspapers are available online in digital format. So it's very easy to find an article or an advertisement or a headline online. And so while I never want to actively encourage an institution to dispose of something, if a newspaper clipping is in really terrible condition, it's very likely and very easy for you to reference the information online. And additionally, if you have that photocopy in your collection, you have that also as a point of contact for the researcher or the visitor. So I think in some cases, it's a relatively guilt-free decision, deciding that newspaper clippings of poor quality can be disposed of. What adhesive do you use for building custom blueboard boxes for long-term storage? And the answer to that is a PVA glue, a polyvinyl acetate glue. This question is coming from Wayne, and I have several sources for you to find a good provider of that glue. if you want to send me an email. PVA glue is also found in catalogs like Gaylord and Hollinger, I think also on Amazon. So we're getting to the end of the time that we have blocked for the Zoom meeting. And I apologize, I haven't made it all the way down to the end of this chat box. I actually have 40 questions here. It's the nature of this format that is sometimes kind of complicated if I get a lot of questions. But I reassure you that I will absolutely reply to an email if you'd like to send me a message this afternoon, tomorrow, or next week. I would be more than pleased to talk to you. Oh, Leah says she can extend the Zoom. Okay, let's do it. All right. So if you can hang on for a few more minutes, I'm going to start scrolling back up in the questions. Okay. But if you have to go, please don't be shy about sending an email. Okay. So this is the first occasion I have heard that creating enclosures with a 3M double-sided tape was not recommended, including a number of national resources. Is there documentation supporting this? I'm sure there is, but we don't recommend the double-sided tape to create an enclosure under most circumstances. So in the conservation lab, of course, you have to understand that we get a variety of materials. Some materials could potentially be a little bit more robust and appropriate for creating this double-sided tape enclosure, though it's not generally something that we encourage. When we are making these double-sided tape enclosures, we frequently will use a piece of fishing wire. What am I trying to say? It's a clear. It looks like the twine that you use at the end of the fishing rod. You can get it in a quality product for preservation work, and that twine is actually inserted in the enclosure between the artifact and the double-sided tape. That is the preferred way to protect an artifact from moving into the adhesive and to also create a barrier between the double-sided tape and the artifact itself. Monofilament, there we go. Thanks, Ben. Sometimes the words just don't come to you, in particular during a webinar. Okay, I see several people actually asking me for the phase box handout. So let's do this. Leah, would you please also include some of those phase box handouts with the email, the follow-up email that you send after the webinar? Let's do that. I have at least 2 that I can include on that email. Thanks, Leah. Can we have a copy of your presentation as well as the handouts? Yes, this presentation will be posted to our YouTube channel, I believe. Leah, correct me if I'm wrong. So that, yes, please use it as a resource. There's so much about housing basics to try and cover in an hour. My hope was that with the supplemental handouts, you can go into more depth with regards to some of the housing scenarios as you like. So there are at least, in addition to the webinar itself, there are at least 4 other handouts that you should consult as a reference moving forward. Is Mylar okay to use? Yes, Mylar is a proprietary name, and it is absolutely, in some cases, preferred to use. The Mylar comes in a variety of thicknesses, from a 2 millimeter up to, I think I've used as thick as a 4 or 5 millimeter. So you would want to be especially attentive to choosing a Mylar sheet that was the appropriate robustness to use with your artifact. So some particularly fragile documents will like a thicker support around them, and for other artifacts, it's just simply not necessary. Oh, Caroline, I'm sorry, I don't have a tutorial for creating the bumper boxes for scrolls and rolled items, but I will share with you that one of the research assignments that we have been working on during shelter at home, thank you COVID, is a handout and a unique reference on rolled items. So I don't know if Anna is on this webinar with us, but I would love to share that new resource with you when it becomes available. So I would say check back on our website in another few months, and if you can't wait, send me an email, and it's possible that I could send you an early version of that email right to your email box. You're welcome. Okay. Thank you, Ben, for the extra information on the Audi testing for the double stick tape. I've seen what happens when the double stick tape comes in contact with an artifact, and that is sad. Oh, here's a really good question. You mentioned that zeolites last about 10 years. Do they start off gassing or degrading at all? And the answer to that question is they are just less effective. The reservoir that is the zeolite fills up. And so what you do is you just replace the material. So if, for example, you are using an interleaving sheet with zeolites, you can just remove the zeolite sheet and replace it with a new one. Okay, I think I've gotten to most of your questions. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today. If I have accidentally sideswiped your chat question, or if other things come to mind later, please do email me. And thank you for spending this time with me today on behalf of the RHSP initiative. Have a great rest of your week. Take care.